In the city where wealth rises like glass towers against the desert sky, and power flows silently behind tinted windows, even the smallest accident can ignite a chain of events capable of reshaping destinies. This is the story of a child who made a mistake so simple it could have been forgotten in seconds, yet it collided head-on with the ego of one of Dubai's most feared billionaires. What unfolded next exposed the fragile border between privilege and humanity, revealing how a single scratch on metal can uncover cracks inside a man's soul. This is not a tale about money, but about the invisible lives that orbit it and the moment they finally collide. The scream echoed across the private marina just seconds after the faint scraping noise sliced through the morning calm. A single trembling child stood frozen beside a sleek, obsidian-black hypercar, its paint now marked by a thin, unmistakable line that caught the sunlight like an accusation. Before anyone could breathe, the billionaire's security team rushed forward, their boots pounding the pavement as if responding to a national emergency, not a simple scratch. Guests at the waterfront cafe turned their heads, watching the scene unfold with the hungry curiosity of people who sense drama but pretend innocence. The child, barely 8, clutched a toy car in his shaking hand, its plastic wheels still flecked with black paint. His eyes darted from the hypercar to the approaching guards, unable to understand why everyone suddenly looked at him as though he had committed a crime. And then the billionaire himself stepped out of his penthouse elevator overlooking the marina, his eyes instantly locking onto the scratch. His gaze sharpened, jaw tightening, as if the mark on his car had been carved onto his own skin. In that moment, the world around the boy collapsed into silence, and one truth crystallized. A tiny mistake had just awakened the fury of a man who was not known for mercy. Amir's life had always unfolded nosed in the shadows of Dubai's glittering skyline, where wealth towered over him like a silent reminder of everything he did not have. His mother, Layla, worked endless hours as a housekeeper in one of the billionaire's luxury residences, scrubbing marble floors until her knuckles bled and pressing crisp linens that she could never afford to sleep on. Amir spent his afternoons waiting for her in the staff quarters, listening to the distant hum of supercars and the laughter of children who had entire playgrounds built on penthouse rooftops. Yet despite the weight of poverty pressing against him like a constant desert heat, he carried a secret gentleness, a fascination with machines, gears, engines, anything that moved. His toy cars were old and scratched, but in his hands they came alive with stories of races he dreamed he'd one day truly run. Every morning before school, Amir helped his mother fold laundry, a ritual that taught him a quiet discipline most adults lacked. He would watch her fingers move quickly, almost gracefully, despite the exhaustion she tried to hide under a tired smile. The world treated her like she was invisible, someone born to serve, someone who didn't belong within the glass towers she cleaned. Amir saw it every day, security guards ignoring her greetings, wealthy residents brushing past her as if she were merely part of the building's design. And though she never complained, he felt the injustice burn inside him like a small fire he couldn't extinguish. Still, Layla kept telling him the same words, whispering them like a prayer. One day, you'll rise above all this. You just have to keep your heart clean, even when the world isn't. Those words shaped him more than she ever realized. But behind that calm exterior, Amir carried a dream he told no one, not even his mother. He wanted to become an engineer, someone capable of fixing the machines he admired from afar. He would sit for hours, studying the engines of the wealthy residents' cars whenever he could sneak a glance, quietly memorizing their shapes, their parts, their rhythm. He knew every model by sound alone, from the deep growl of European supercars to the razor-sharp whine of the billionaire's custom-built hypercar. But dreams born in poverty often feel like fragile sandcastles facing an incoming tide. Every debt notice pinned to the staff bulletin board, every whispered complaint about hours being cut, every reminder that life for people like them could crumble without warning. It all kept Amir grounded in a painful reality. and yet he remained hopeful, unaware that fate was about to drag him into a storm far larger than any dream he had ever dared to imagine. Sultan Rashid al-Masari was the kind of man whose presence shifted the air in a room long before he spoke. His fortune came from energy, tech, and a labyrinth of offshore investments no one fully understood. And yet everyone feared. He owned penthouses in 3 continents, a private island shaped like his initials, and a fleet of cars so rare that even collectors whispered his name with a mix of envy and awe. But what truly set him apart was not the wealth. It was the cold precision with which he protected it. Sultan believed control was the only real currency in the world, and he spent his life enforcing it like a doctrine. Employees walked straighter when he passed. Investors lowered their voices. Even rivals avoided eye contact. His reputation could break a man long before any legal contract did. He had climbed from modest origins decades earlier, but the climb had hardened him into something unrecognizable even to those who once knew him. Failure, to Sultan, was not an event. It was an insult. Disrespect, even accidental, was unforgivable, and above all, he valued perfection. His hypercar collection was maintained with almost religious devotion, each vehicle tuned by specialists flown in from Germany, Japan, and Italy. To him, a scratch was not damage, it was contamination. It symbolized loss of order, loss of hierarchy, and he would rather fire an entire staff than allow a single imperfection to stain the image he built. He ruled his world like a monarch whose crown was made of polished steel and silence. But beneath that exterior of discipline and glamour lay a storm few ever witnessed. Sultan carried an anger that lived close to the surface, something that simmered just behind his measured tone. It showed in the way his jaw tightened when a document wasn't perfectly aligned or when a driver parked 2 inches off the mark. Those close to him whispered rumors, stories of a past tragedy, a betrayal early in his rise, a moment of vulnerability that had closed his heart for good. No one dared ask him directly because Sultan did not explain himself. He demanded compliance, not understanding. And when he stepped onto the marina that morning, seeing the thin scratch slicing through the flawless paint of his prized hypercar, the entire world felt that hidden storm shift, gathering force, ready to break over the head of the terrified child who had made the mistake of touching a king's crown. The moment Sultan's eyes fell on the trembling child, the marina seemed to shrink around them, pulling every whisper and every gaze into a single point of tension. He approached with slow, deliberate steps, the kind that made grown men reconsider every decision they had ever made. The guards parted instantly, forming a corridor of silent intimidation. Amir was shaking so hard that his toy car slipped from his hand and clattered onto the pavement. Sultan's lips curled with controlled disgust as he examined the scratch again, then lowered his gaze toward Amir, not with anger but with something colder, a clinical judgment that made the boy feel less like a person and more like a stain. And in a voice sharp enough to cut steel, Sultan asked, "Do you know what you've done?" The words carried across the marina, turning every bystander's curiosity into guilty fascination. In that instant, Amir felt the full weight of a world where mistakes made by the poor were treated as crimes against the powerful. Layla arrived running, breathless, her uniform still damp from the laundry room, her eyes widening in horror as she saw her son cornered by guards. She dropped to her knees beside Amir, placing her arms around him with trembling urgency. But her attempt to shield him only seemed to irritate Sultan more. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to silence, and the gesture alone felt like a command delivered from a throne. "Your son damaged property worth more than your entire life's earnings," he said with cutting clarity, loud enough for everyone to hear. The humiliation hit Layla like a blow. She had scrubbed this man's floors, polished his windows, served his guests with the kind of quiet dignity that came from necessity, not submission. Yet now, with a single sentence, he stripped her of every shred of pride she had fought to protect. The crowd watched without moving, weighed down by the cruel math of hierarchy, a maid's son versus a billionaire's car. When Layla tried to apologize, her voice cracked, but Sultan didn't care for apologies. He demanded accountability, and he wanted the world to witness it. He ordered the guards to take photos, to document the damage, to write a report, as if the child were a criminal and not a frightened boy who had simply dropped his toy. Amir buried his face in his mother's shoulder, sobbing quietly while cameras clicked around him. Sultan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness was the humiliation. It was the message that people like Layla and Amir lived at the mercy of men like him, and even a scratch, just a line of paint missing, was enough to remind them of their place. And when he turned away, leaving Layla on her knees beside her shaking son, the silence he left behind felt heavier than the scolding itself, as if he had already delivered a punishment no apology could undo. While the crowd slowly dispersed, Amir wiped his tears with the back of his hand and looked once more at the scratch on the car, this time with a different gaze. Fear still shook inside him, but another impulse began to rise: curiosity, the same instinct that had always guided his. Hands when he explored the engines of passing cars. He gently stepped closer, ignoring the warning looks from the guards, and crouched beside the hypercar. Layla tried to pull him back, terrified of provoking Sultan further, but Amir whispered, "Mama, it's not deep." His small finger traced the line, analyzing the way the light refracted across the paint. He wasn't guessing, he was studying. He recognized the texture, the depth, the pattern. "It didn't reach the clear coat," he murmured. With surprising calm, a few guards frowned, exchanging puzzled glances. For the first time, Amir wasn't trembling, he was thinking. One of the mechanics who maintained Sultan's vehicles happened to pass by, carrying a toolbox, and paused at the strange sight of a child assessing a multi-million-dollar machine with the seriousness of a seasoned technician. Amir looked up at the man and said softly but confidently, "If you use a micro-polish pad with a soft compound, it will disappear." "No respray needed." The mechanic blinked, caught off guard. He knelt down beside the boy, inspected the scratch under the same angle Amir had used, and his eyes widened just a little. The kid was right. Completely right. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Amir shrugged. "I study the cars when they come in. I listen. I watch." That innocence, mixed with hidden intelligence, created a tension the guards weren't prepared for. This wasn't a child trying to escape blame. This was someone who saw the world differently, someone whose mind worked in quiet, precise ways. By the time Sultan turned back, frustrated after a phone call, he found an unexpected scene. His own mechanic, kneeling beside the boy who had damaged his prized hypercar, nodding at him with an expression that looked disturbingly like respect. "Sir," the mechanic began cautiously, "the damage is superficial." The boy noticed it before I did. Sultan's eyebrows rose, a flicker of surprise breaking through his cold facade. He stepped closer, not because he believed them, but because he wanted to see the truth for himself. Amir stood there, small but composed, meeting the billionaire's gaze with a mixture of fear and an unintentional confidence. For a brief second, just one, Sultan felt something he had not expected, the uncomfortable realization that this child saw his machine with the same precision he did. It wasn't enough to erase the crime, but it was enough to shift something deep and imperceptible inside the man who believed perfection belonged only to him. The brief moment of respect Amir had earned vanished the instant Sultan's pride reasserted itself. A billionaire like him could not, would not, allow a child to be the one to calm the storm he had created. His voice returned sharper, icier, stripping away any trace of the curiosity he had felt seconds before. "Superficial or not," he declared, eyes fixed on Layla, "your son damaged something that does not belong to him, and you will both learn the cost of carelessness." Layla felt her stomach twist as the guards straightened, awaiting orders. Sultan turned to his chief of staff and said, without hesitation, "Terminate her contract. Effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the marina. Layla's breath caught, her knees weakening beneath her. Losing this job meant losing their home, their visas, their stability, everything. Amir grabbed her hand, confused, unable to understand how his attempt to help had only made things worse. Layla tried to plead, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. "Please, sir, it was an accident. He's a child. I'll pay for the repair. Anything. Just don't fire me." But Sultan stood unmoved, sculpted from the same cold resolve that built his empire. "The wealthy," he said quietly, "cannot afford to tolerate incompetence. You should have taught him boundaries." His words were daggers, precise and emotionless. The guards approached Layla to escort her out, but Amir stepped in front of her with his arms outstretched, small, trembling but determined. "It's not her fault," he said, tears filling his eyes. "It was me. Punish me." His voice was so raw, so desperate, that even a few bystanders looked away, but Sultan didn't. He stared at the boy, studying him with a strange mixture of annoyance and fascination, then turned away again. "Children don't pay debts," he murmured. "Parents do." By the time the sun dipped behind the towers, Layla and Amir were escorted off the property like intruders, rather than people who had faithfully served for years. Their access cards were disabled, their belongings packed hastily into bags they barely had time to check. The humiliation clung to them like dust. Layla tried to stay strong, but Amir could see the truth in her eyes, the terror, the shame, the uncertainty of where they would sleep tonight. As they stepped out onto the crowded street, the world felt different, louder, harsher, indifferent. The same boy who had shown a spark of hidden genius hours earlier now felt crushed beneath the weight of a punishment far bigger than his mistake. And though he didn't know it yet, this fall, this painful, unjust, humiliating fall, was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of something far greater, something fate had been quietly preparing behind the scenes. Night settled over Dubai like a velvet curtain stitched with gold. But for Layla and Amir, it brought no comfort. They walked through the city's quieter backstreets, carrying the weight of uncertainty in every step. Layla tried calling friends, former co-workers, anyone who might lend a couch or a floor for the night. Most didn't answer. Those who did whispered apologies, afraid to be associated with someone dismissed by Sultan Rashid himself. His influence stretched further than any contract, and everyone knew it. As they reached a dimly lit bus stop, Amir clutched her hand, tightly fighting back tears. They sat in silence, surrounded by the hum of passing cars, when suddenly Layla's phone vibrated, a number she recognized instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Sultan, calling her, after destroying her life just hours earlier. Layla hesitated, afraid of what more he could possibly take from them, but Amir's eyes urged her to answer. Not out of hope, but out of necessity. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Yes, sir?" But the tone on the other end was different, not softened, not apologetic, just controlled. "I need to see the boy," Sultan said. "Both of you, tomorrow morning, penthouse tower, level 73. Before Layla could form a question, the call ended with a click that echoed louder than any of his previous words. Confusion washed over her. Why would he want to see Amir? Had someone convinced him to reconsider? Or was this yet another step in his cold, unpredictable form of punishment? She looked at her son, who stared back with a mixture of fear and something else, an instinctive sense that their lives were being pulled in a direction neither of them understood. That night, they slept in a tiny hostel room offered by a kind receptionist who'd overheard part of their story. The bed was lumpy, the sheets rough, but exhaustion swallowed them quickly. Yet Layla barely slept. Her thoughts spiraled around Sultan's unexpected demand. Was he going to file charges? Force them to pay an impossible fee? Deport them? Every scenario ended in disaster. Meanwhile, Amir dreamed restlessly, visions of gears, engines and bright lights flickering behind his eyelids. He woke before dawn, sensing something big was coming. Bigger than the scratch, bigger than the humiliation, bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And as they prepared to return to the very building that had expelled them hours earlier, neither mother nor son realized that the call had not been an act of cruelty, but the first signal of a destiny quietly unfolding beneath the surface of their pain. When Layla and Amir arrived at the glass tower the next morning, the atmosphere felt different from the day before. The guards who had once dragged them out now escorted them in with stiff politeness, avoiding eye contact as if ashamed of their own obedience. The elevator climbed in silence, its mirrored walls reflecting the tension etched across Layla's face. Level 73 opened into a private penthouse foyer where everything gleamed. Marble floors like still water, walls lined with rare art, the air scented faintly with oud and polished metal. Sultan stood near the window, gazing out at the cityscape as the rising sun painted the skyline in orange and gold. He didn't turn when they entered. Instead, he spoke in a low voice that made Layla's hands tremble. "Last night," he said, "my team discovered a serious problem, one that requires unconventional assistance." Only then did he turn to face them, his expression unreadable. He nodded toward a sleek security panel connected to a display of his hypercar fleet, a catalogue of perfection now disrupted by a flashing red alert. "One of my vehicles," he explained, "has suffered a systems malfunction, a malfunction even my specialists can't diagnose. And before you say anything, no, it has nothing to do with your son's accident." He stepped closer, studying Amir with a calculating gaze. "But the mechanic you spoke to yesterday reported something unusual, that you noticed details he missed, that you recognized a flaw at first glance." Amir swallowed hard, unsure if he was being praised or trapped. Sultan continued, "My top engineers spent all night on this malfunction. They found nothing, yet the boy who scratched my car seemed to see what grown men could not." His voice grew tighter, the admission clearly costing him. "I need someone who sees differently, someone like him." Layla felt a jolt of disbelief. After firing her, humiliating her, and nearly breaking her spirit, Sultan now stood before her asking for help from the very child he had punished. She opened her mouth to protest, but Sultan raised a hand, his pride slipping through the cracks in his composure. "This is not charity," he clarified sharply. "This is necessity. The malfunction could compromise a deal worth millions. I will not allow that." His gaze returned to Amir, sharper, more intent. "Boy, if you can identify what my experts cannot, I will reconsider your mother's termination. I might even offer compensation." Amir looked up at his mother, his small chest rising and falling with nervous breaths. Despite everything, despite the fear, despite the injustice, there was something inside him, a quiet courage, born from years of watching engines and dreaming in silence. He stepped forward, and for the first time, Sultan Rashid al-Masari looked not down at him, but directly at him, as an equal in the one realm where money meant nothing, raw, instinctive talent. For a moment, the room held its breath. Sultan expected immediate compliance. He was a man accustomed to snapping his fingers and watching the world rearrange itself to satisfy his will, but Amir didn't move. He stood perfectly still, eyes fixed not on the billionaire, but on his mother. Layla gently squeezed his hand, silently encouraging him to speak only if he felt safe. Something shifted inside Amir then, not defiance but clarity. He took a small step forward and lifted his chin, his voice soft but steady. "I'll help you," he said, "but not if my mother is punished for something she didn't do." Sultan blinked, surprised by the firmness in the boy's tone. Children weren't supposed to negotiate with him. Adults barely dared. Yet here stood an 8-year-old, drawing a boundary no one in Sultan's world had ever attempted. Layla's breath hitched as Sultan turned his full attention to her, analyzing her expression as if she were part of the deal. She braced herself, expecting fury or mockery. Instead, he narrowed his eyes with irritated curiosity. "You're making demands?" he asked. Amir nodded. "Yes, my mom gets her job back, and she doesn't get blamed for this." And his voice wavered for a moment, but he pushed through it. "You don't shout at her again." The words hit the air like a spark. The guards by the elevators stiffened, their eyes widening. Layla's heart pounded in her ears. Sultan's expression darkened, not in anger but in disbelief that someone so small dared to set terms in front of him. The audacity fascinated him more than it offended him. Silence stretched until it felt like the room itself was waiting for Sultan's verdict. Finally, he exhaled sharply and turned away, walking toward the security panel, as if contemplating the weight of his own pride. "Very well," he said at last, his voice clipped. "Your mother's employment will be restored for now." Layla's knees weakened with relief, but Sultan wasn't finished. He faced Amir again, this time without the condescension he once wielded like a blade. "But understand this, boy. If you waste my time, if you fail, or if you overstep again, I will not be so accommodating." Amir nodded, the seriousness of the moment anchoring him. "I won't fail." For the first time, Sultan believed he meant it. In that room of marble and steel, a new, fragile balance formed, one the billionaire wasn't used to, and one the child was just beginning to navigate. a balance where power was no longer held by wealth alone, but by the courage to speak truth, even with a trembling voice. The moment Amir agreed, the penthouse transformed into a private workshop. Sultan snapped his fingers, and within minutes a team of technicians rolled in specialized equipment, diagnostic tablets, holographic schematics, polished toolkits arranged like surgical instruments. Amir had never seen anything like it. The room hummed with soft mechanical sounds, blinking LEDs, and the quiet tension of adults waiting to be proven wrong. Layla stood close by, unsure whether to shield her son or let him breathe. But Amir instinctively stepped forward, his eyes absorbing every detail. The malfunctioning hypercar's data appeared on a massive screen, layers of pathways, codes, and systems stacked like a mechanical labyrinth. The engineers expected confusion. Instead, Amir leaned in, studying each flicker, each anomaly, each electrical pulse. His mind, sharpened by years of quiet observation, began piecing together patterns the adults had overlooked. For the first time, Layla saw not just her son's curiosity, but his brilliance emerging like a sunrise. Sultan watched with a tight, controlled expression, equal parts skepticism and involuntary intrigue. He wasn't used to waiting. He wasn't used to hoping either. Yet, as Amir worked, something shifted in the room. The boy handled the interface with the gentleness of someone who respected machines rather than commanded them. He asked thoughtful questions, not to show off, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the deeper layers of the system. The chief engineer exchanged glances with his team, quietly impressed. "He sees the micro-delays," one whispered, "the shifts in the torque mapping." It was something no one had identified yet. Sultan crossed his arms, trying not to show the faint spark of fascination lighting behind his eyes. The boy wasn't guessing, he was diagnosing, and he was doing it with a natural precision the billionaire hadn't seen, even among his most elite specialists. Hours passed, and Amir's confidence grew. He traced the origin of the malfunction to a tiny calibration fault caused by friction levels in a new energy recovery module, an error so microscopic it didn't even trigger the standard alerts. He explained it, slowly, awkwardly at first, then with increasing certainty as the engineers followed his logic. When he pointed out a small misalignment in the module's blueprint, the team fell silent. It was the solution. Not theoretical, real, fixable. One of the engineers tested his hypothesis, recalibrating the model, and the system's warning light flickered, then disappeared entirely. The room erupted in stunned disbelief. Sultan remained still, his face unreadable, but his eyes had changed. There was no denying what had happened. A child, not trained, not educated, not wealthy, had just outperformed men with decades of experience. Layla covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Amir stepped back, chest rising fast, the weight of the moment finally catching up with him, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small, shy smile. He had not just risen, he had soared. By late afternoon, Sultan's penthouse transformed once again, this time into a formal arena of judgment. A negotiation hall had been arranged on the upper level, where investors from 3 countries were scheduled to review the hypercar project before finalizing a multi-million-dollar contract. The malfunction Amir had solved threatened to derail the entire deal, and Sultan could not afford even a whisper of uncertainty. The atmosphere was high stakes and electric, with polished glass tables, towering digital displays, and the skyline of Dubai burning gold behind them like a stage backdrop. Amir stood beside his mother near the back, feeling small among suits, signatures, and men who spoke in clipped tones about numbers he couldn't imagine. Sultan approached them briefly, his voice low and controlled. "If what you fixed holds," he said, "this meeting will end in triumph. If it doesn't, it will end in disaster." Then he added, without meeting their eyes, "Stay close. You may be needed." And just like that, the boy who once swept floors in silence was now part of a room built for kings. The investors arrived with the presence of men accustomed to owning futures. They carried themselves with slow confidence, shaking hands with Sultan while their assistants prepared tablets and documents. They expected a flawless presentation, nothing less. As the demonstration began, engineers activated the hypercar system remotely, projecting its internal diagnostics in front of the committee. Sultan spoke with commanding eloquence, his voice steady as he highlighted the vehicle's capabilities and innovations. But beneath the authoritative cadence lay a thread of tension only Amir seemed to notice. A subtle tightening of the jaw, a brief hesitation on certain words. Sultan was relying on the correction Amir had made, and the stakes pressed against him like invisible armor. Amir felt his heart thudding in his chest. Every number, every graph on display was a testament to whether he had been right. If the system failed now, he knew Sultan's wrath could destroy not only their fragile truce, but their future. As the final diagnostic test initiated, the room fell into a heavy, anticipatory silence. The holographic projection expanded, revealing the energy module, the very heart of the malfunction. A single error could unravel everything. Sultan clasped his hands behind his back, his eyes locked on the data stream. Lila held Amir's shoulder, whispering a silent prayer under her breath. The system scanned, calculated, recalibrated, and for several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. One raised a brow, another tapped his pen impatiently, and then the final light turned green. Not flickering, not delayed. Perfect. The room exhaled as if oxygen had suddenly returned. The investors applauded politely, but Sultan's reaction was different. He simply closed his eyes for a brief moment, an instant of raw relief he didn't allow anyone to see. Then he turned toward Amir, and though the expression was impossibly small, almost invisible, there was a spark of acknowledgement, a silent admission that the smallest person in the room had carried the weight of the largest responsibility and had not faltered. But triumph has a way of stirring envy in the shadows, and not everyone in the room was pleased with the flawless demonstration. Among the engineers standing near the display was Karim al-Haddad, Sultan's longest-serving technician, highly paid, highly respected, and secretly terrified of being exposed. He had been the one responsible for installing the new energy recovery module. He had been the one who missed the calibration fault, and if the investors ever discovered that negligence on a project this massive, he would be finished. When the system had malfunctioned the night before, he'd hoped it would take weeks to diagnose, maybe months, enough time for him to quietly correct his mistake and take credit for the fix. But everything changed when Amir walked in with those sharp, innocent eyes and solved the problem Karim had pretended was unsolvable. Watching a child succeed where he'd failed lit a fire of resentment deep in his gut, burning hotter with every applause echoing through the hall. As the investors congratulated Sultan and prepared to sign the binding agreements, Karim slipped toward the diagnostic console, forced a smile plastered on his sweating face. He typed commands with confident gestures, but his heart raced chaotically. Beneath the surface, his plan was simple but devastating: alter the logs. If he could manipulate the data to make it seem like Amir had introduced instability rather than solved it, he could discredit the boy, salvage his own reputation, and possibly even convince Sultan that bringing them back had been a mistake. In an empire built on perfection, even the hint of a flaw could ruin a life, and Karim knew Sultan was desperate to preserve his image, desperate enough to believe that a Maid's son might have tampered with something he didn't understand. The engineer's fingers flew across the touchscreen as he implanted a corrupted data string into the system logs, subtle, nearly invisible, the kind of sabotage only an expert could craft. He glanced over his shoulder and smirked. The boy would never see it coming, but fate has a strange way of favoring the observant. Amir, still standing beside his mother at the back of the room, noticed something small, something no one else saw. The holographic schematic behind Karim flickered for a fraction of a second, emitting a micro blip that didn't match the system's normal behavior. Most people would have looked past it or assumed it was just a glitch in the display. But to Amir, patterns were like language, and that flicker spoke a warning louder than any shout. His eyes narrowed, tracking the engineer's hands, the specific sequence he entered, the timing. Something was wrong, very wrong, and before Layla could stop him, Amir took a step forward, his pulse pounding with equal parts fear and certainty. The great arena had found its true battleground, and the hidden enemy had just revealed himself. Amir moved closer to the diagnostic display, drawn not by curiosity this time, but by instinct, an instinct sharpened by hours of watching machines breathe and whisper. From across the room he saw the pattern forming, a subtle distortion in the system's data stream that didn't match the operational signature he had studied earlier. It was like seeing a familiar road suddenly bend in a direction it shouldn't. Karim stepped away from the console, forcing a triumphant calm across his features, but Amir kept watching the faint echo of the corrupted data pulse ripple through the schematic. He leaned forward, squinting. There, hidden beneath the authorized system calls, was a string of mismatched values, too precise to be accidental. Someone had tampered with the logs. He knew it the way he knew the sound of an engine misfiring or the temperature shift of heated metal. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a lie. And his heart began to beat harder as the truth crystallized. Someone was trying to frame him. He tugged on Layla's sleeve. "Mama, something is wrong." She followed his gaze to the floating schematic, but saw nothing unusual, only the cold geometry of lines and nodes. Before she could respond, Amir slipped out of her grasp and walked straight toward the console, weaving between suited investors and murmuring assistants. Sultan turned sharply, irritation flaring until he saw the boy's face, focused, determined, almost fearless. "What are you doing?" he demanded, but Amir didn't look at him. He pointed at the screen. "This data is fake," he said, his voice louder than he intended. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Investors paused their signing. Sultan's eyes widened slightly, not in belief, but in surprise at the boy's audacity. Karim laughed, a shaky, dismissive sound. "Fake? The child doesn't even understand what he's looking at." But Amir didn't retreat. His small finger traced the string of manipulated values. "These numbers weren't here during the test. They don't match the module's natural response time. Someone added them after the scan." For the first time, Karim's smile faltered. The room tensed, thick with the charged silence that precedes revelation. Sultan stepped closer, his expression darkening, not with anger at Amir, but with a dangerous curiosity aimed squarely at Karim. Amir continued, his confidence growing with each word. "See this?" he said, pointing at the micro-blip he had noticed earlier. "That's the system trying to correct something it didn't create. It's reacting to a false entry." The chief engineer, drawn by the tension, inspected the code and his eyes widened. "He's right," he whispered. "This wasn't here before." Murmurs erupted around the room. Karim's face drained of color as he stepped back, hands trembling. The investors watched with growing suspicion. Sultan's gaze sharpened to a blade's edge. A lie had been planted. A trap had been set. And now, in front of the most powerful men in the city, a child, quiet, observant, underestimated, had exposed the sabotage with a single undeniable truth. He saw everything others ignored. The fraud was no longer hidden. It was cornered. Sultan's gaze bore into Karim with an intensity that made even the investors step back. The engineer stammered excuses, strings of half-finished sentences crumbling under their own panic. I don't know how that got there. Maybe the system glitched. Maybe the boy misunderstood, but his voice lacked the confidence of a man telling the truth. Amir watched him carefully, his mind racing. Accusing Karim outright would only lead to chaos. People like him were slippery. They survived on technicalities, loopholes, and the benefit of the doubt. If Amir wanted justice, he needed more than suspicion. He needed evidence. He needed Karim to expose himself. And so, with a composure far beyond his age, Amir stepped forward and pointed at the console. "If I'm wrong, he said, voice steady and clear. Then let him run the manual integrity test. A hush fell over the room. Karim froze. Everyone knew the integrity test was brutally honest. It scanned the command history, time-stamped every interaction, and recorded the user signature behind each alteration. If he had tampered with the logs, the system would reveal it instantly, with no room to lie. Sultan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A fair suggestion, he said. Investors nodded. Even the chief engineer, who had always respected Karim, stepped aside in solemn agreement. But Karim panicked. "There's no need for that," he blurted. "We should trust the initial scan. These tests take too long. It will delay the meeting." His voice cracked mid-sentence. Delay what? The system or his downfall? Amir crossed his arms, watching him closely. "If you didn't do anything wrong," the boy said softly, "why are you afraid of a test?" The jab landed with surgical precision. Karim flushed, sweat pooling at his temples. He reached for the console, but his shaking fingers hovered, not over the test command, but over the abort menu, and that was all Amir needed. "Look!" he said loudly, pointing. "He's trying to cancel the test." Gasps erupted around the room. Karim jerked his hand back as though the panel had burned him, but the damage was already done. His fear had spoken louder than any accusation could. Sultan stepped forward slowly, like a predator closing in. "Run! The test!" His voice was a quiet storm. Karim's shoulders sagged, his last thread of resistance snapping. With trembling hands, he activated the integrity scan. The system whirred to life, projecting lines of code and timestamps in the air. Investors watched, like spectators at an execution. After several agonizing seconds, the results appeared, and they were damning. The logs revealed the exact moment Karim had injected the false data, tagged with his user ID, his device signature, his location. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Karim collapsed to his knees, muttering apologies that no one cared to hear. Sultan's expression hardened, not with rage, but with cold, decisive authority. "You tried to sabotage my project," he said, voice calm and terrifying. "And worse, you tried to blame a child." He signaled the guards with a flick of his hand. Karim was escorted out, defeated and exposed. Amir stood silently beside his mother, his chest rising with steady breaths. He had not only uncovered the lie, he had crafted the trap that forced the truth into the light, and every powerful man in that room had witnessed it. The room shifted instantly once Karim was dragged out, almost as if an invisible weight had been lifted. From the air, investors who moments ago had doubted Amir now looked at him with a startling mixture of admiration and disbelief. In a world dominated by power, age, and wealth, brilliance this pure was impossible to ignore. Sultan stood at the center of it all, a man who rarely showed emotion, yet something indefinable flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps even pride, but buried beneath layers of control. He motioned for everyone's attention, his posture straightening as the authority in his voice returned. "Gentlemen," he announced, "you have not only witnessed the reliability of our technology, but the integrity of our team." He gestured subtly toward Amir. "The system is flawless. The project is flawless. And now we move forward." The investors exchanged nods and smiles, reassured not only by the successful demonstration but by Sultan's unwavering control over the crisis. Moments later, signatures flowed across digital tablets. The contract, worth more than anything Layla could imagine, was sealed. But then something unexpected happened. As the room applauded lightly, Sultan walked toward Amir and Layla, and the entire hall fell silent. No one approached the help. No one acknowledged them. It simply wasn't done. Yet Sultan did. He stopped in front of the small boy who had saved his project twice in a single day, and extended his hand, not to pat him on the head, not to condescend, but to shake it. It was a gesture so rare coming from him that even his own staff exchanged stunned glances. Amir hesitated, then shook it. The billionaire's tone softened just enough to break through the armor he wore. "You protected the truth," he said, "and you protected my name. That takes courage." He turned to Layla, who was trembling from the enormity of the moment. "Your position is fully restored," he said firmly, "and your salary will be increased, effective immediately." Layla covered her mouth, tears blurring her vision. For years she had worked in silence, invisible to the man she cleaned for. Now, suddenly, she mattered. As the investors departed and the tension diffused, Sultan's staff gathered around Amir, offering congratulations that felt surreal and overwhelming. The chief engineer knelt to the boy's eye level, humbled. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "One we couldn't teach even if we tried." Layla hugged her son tightly, the pride and relief flooding through her like warm light after a long night. Amir exhaled shakily, realizing that for the first time in his life, he wasn't being looked down upon. He was being seen, truly seen. The victory was not only in exposing Karim or securing the contract, it was in reclaiming their dignity. The boy who had been humiliated in front of strangers now stood, celebrated, in front of giants. And though he didn't fully grasp it yet, Amir had done something extraordinary. He had rewritten the balance of power in a room where he was never meant to have a voice. The world had changed for them, and it was only the beginning. As dusk settled over the city, painting the skyline with streaks of rose and amber, Layla and Amir stepped out of Sultan's tower, transformed by the events of the day. They walked through the same corridors that had once escorted them out in disgrace, but now every step felt different, lighter, steadier, as though the marble itself acknowledged their return. The guards who had previously avoided their eyes now nodded respectfully, their postures softened by quiet admiration. Even the receptionist, who had once treated Layla as just another uniform, greeted her with a warmth that wasn't feigned. The late afternoon breeze carried the faint scent of the ocean, and Amir felt taller somehow, as if the world had subtly expanded around him. They weren't leaving in fear this time. They were walking out with dignity, restored and reinforced, their heads held high in a way neither had dared before. The ride home was quiet, peaceful. Layla looked at her son from time to time, marveling at the transformation she saw taking place right before her eyes. Amir wasn't just the curious boy who liked engines anymore. He had stood in a room full of powerful men. He had defended the truth with a bravery she had never seen, even in adults, and he had won. Yet he still sat there with his small hands folded, kicking his feet softly against the bus seat, chewing on his bottom lip the way he always did when thinking. "Mama, do you think I really helped?" he asked, voice small and uncertain, as if the weight of the day had finally caught up with him. Layla placed her hand gently on his cheek. "Amir," she whispered, "you didn't just help, you changed everything." Her voice broke slightly, filled with equal parts pride and disbelief. She realized then that their future, once fragile as sand, now had something solid beneath it, possibility. When they arrived at their modest apartment, the space felt different, almost sacred. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't wealth, but it was theirs, and tonight it felt like home in a way it never had before. Layla placed her bag down and watched Amir rush to his small collection of toy cars, lined neatly on the shelf. He picked one up, a battered metal model with chipped paint, and held it with new reverence. Those tiny wheels, scratched from years of play, had carried him into a future neither of them could have predicted. As he sat on the rug, lost in thought, Layla realized something profound. They hadn't just returned to their apartment. They had returned as new versions of themselves, stronger, braver, seen. Amir was no longer simply the maid's son. He was something rarer, a child who had earned respect in a world built to silence him. And though neither could fully articulate it, they both felt it deep in their bones. Their story had only just begun. That same evening, long after the sea, investors had departed and the celebration had faded into echoes, Sultan Rashid al-Masari stood alone in his penthouse office, staring at the city lights as if searching for something buried deep within them. The glass walls reflected a version of himself he rarely confronted, older, more tired, more human than the empire he commanded allowed him to appear. He loosened his tie and exhaled, the weight of the day pressing against old wounds he kept stitched shut for years. Amir's courage, his clarity, his refusal to back down, It had struck something raw inside him. A memory he had spent decades burying rose like a ghost. A much younger Sultan, poor, ignored, treated as if he didn't belong anywhere but at the feet of the powerful. He remembered being the boy who touched a rich man's car and was beaten for it. He remembered the humiliation, the helplessness, and the vow he made that day. Never again will anyone have power over me. But over time, that vow twisted. It didn't protect him. It hardened him. He moved toward a hidden drawer beneath his desk, pulling out an old photograph, creased, faded, nearly falling apart. It showed a boy of no more than 9, barefoot, standing beside his father in front of a rusted pickup truck. Sultan ran his thumb along the edges, remembering the night his father lost his job over a mistake he didn't commit, cast out by a wealthy employer who valued metal more than people. That night shaped him. It carved his ambition, sharpened his pride, and turned vulnerability into a luxury he never allowed himself again. As he stared at the picture, he realized with a jolt that history had nearly repeated itself today, but this time he had been the one swinging the hammer. He had stood ready to destroy a mother and child over a scratch. The thought hit him like a punch to the ribs. For the first time in many years, guilt, true, unfiltered, unarmored guilt, rose in his chest. Sultan closed his eyes, the city lights shimmering beneath his lashes. He had built his empire brick by brick, cruelty by necessity, strength by design. But the boy with the steady gaze and the delicate hands had cracked something inside him. Something he hadn't realized had grown rigid and cold. Amir had looked at him not with fear, but with unwavering honesty. And in that honesty, Sultan had glimpsed the child he once was, and the man he feared he had become. He sank into his chair, feeling the boundaries of his pride loosen for the first time in years. He knew now that what happened today wasn't just a business triumph or a narrowly avoided disaster. It was a mirror held to his soul, and in that reflection he saw both a warning and a chance to be more than the cold giant the world believed him to be, a chance he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he could no longer ignore. The next morning, Sultan summoned Layla and Amir back to the tower, not with urgency, not with authority, but with a quiet tone that unsettled everyone who heard it. When they arrived, the atmosphere was strangely calm, no guards glaring, no tension humming in the marble. Sultan stood waiting by the panoramic window, hands clasped behind his back, expression softer but unreadable. Amir approached cautiously, unsure of what awaited them. Sultan turned, clearing his throat before speaking, a rare sign of discomfort. "I owe you both more than an apology," he began. Layla stiffened, startled by the humility threading through his voice. "Your integrity saved my business, your courage saved my reputation, and your son—" He hesitated, as if unused to the softness forming in his own words. "Your son reminded me of something I had forgotten." A pause, a breath. "So I want to offer him a place in our technical academy. Full scholarship, training, a future." Amir's eyes widened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he looked at his mother, seeking permission, grounding. Layla felt tears swell, gratitude rising so quickly it nearly stole her breath. But before she could accept, Amir took a step forward, his small shoulders squared. "I have a condition," he said, surprising even himself. Sultan blinked. Conditions, again, but this time he didn't bristle. He listened. "If I go to your academy," Amir continued, "you have to open more spots. For kids like me, kids who aren't rich, kids who don't get chances." The room froze. Layla gasped softly, stunned by the boy's boldness. Sultan stared at Amir, taken aback not by the request, but by the purity of it. This child, who had every right to ask for anything for himself, chose instead to ask for others, for the invisible children, the ones whose names no one learned. The billionaire's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the effort of holding back unexpected emotion. He paced slowly, hands clasped, absorbing the weight of the request. Creating scholarships would not earn him money. It would not enhance his power. It would cost him time, resources, image. Yet something inside him, the part Amir had stirred awake, recognized the necessity of it, the humanity of it. Sultan turned back to the boy, his voice quiet but firm. "Very well," he said. "Not just one scholarship. not two, a program. He inhaled deeply. A full engineering foundation for underprivileged children. You will be the first member, and the reason it exists. Amir's breath caught. Layla covered her mouth as tears spilled freely. Sultan looked at them both, and for once there was no wall, no armor, no distance. Only truth, only change. That afternoon, as Layla and Amir stepped out of the tower for the final time, not as servants, not as outcasts, but as partners in a new beginning, the city seemed to glow brighter. The sun reflected off the skyscrapers like a promise written across the horizon. Amir walked slightly ahead, his steps lighter than they had ever been, while Layla followed close behind, her heart full in a way she couldn't put into words. She had spent years believing that power belonged only to the wealthy, that people like her and her son were meant to blend into the background. Yet, she had watched her child reshape the world around him, first with truth, then with bravery, and finally with compassion. She realized then that real power did not come from money or reputation. It came from integrity, from courage, from choosing kindness when the world expected silence far above. Them, Sultan watched through the penthouse window, not with the cold detachment he once carried, but with a quiet reverence. He saw the boy who had challenged him, humbled him, changed him, and for the first time in his long, rigid career, he felt an unfamiliar sensation rise in his chest. Hope that perhaps the future of his empire would not be defined by the hardness of the past, but by the brilliance of the next generation. He thought of the foundation he had agreed to build, of the children who would one day walk through its doors, of the opportunities that would ripple outward because one boy dared to demand fairness. And he felt, in a place deep and long neglected, a sense of peace. As mother and son returned to their small apartment, now filled not with fear but with possibility, Amir placed his favorite toy car on the windowsill, letting the evening light shine across its scratched paint. He smiled, knowing that scratches didn't break things. They revealed stories. He glanced at his mother, who smiled back with pride swelling in her eyes. Their journey had begun with a mistake, a moment of fear, and a scratch on the wrong man's car. Yet it had led them to something larger than either could have imagined, a future reshaped by courage, truth, and compassion. And as the sun dipped below the skyline, Amir whispered a question not only to himself, but to the world watching their story unfold. How many lives could change if just one person dared to see potential where others saw none?